Thanks be to God indeed for those words from Paul in his letter to the Ephesians. He's giving us a good outline on how to be children of the light and to live in a way that's pleasing to God. And it's important, I guess, that we look at verses and passages in the Bible like that because it gives us instructions on how we're to make decisions, what we're supposed to do. And we've been in the series, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets, and we're on this fourth question, and it's called the maturity question. Now, it doesn't mean maturity in the sense of growing up, but it means making mature and wise decisions. If you're mature as a Christian, then you should have a certain amount of wisdom. God should have given you that gift so that not only do you make right and good decisions, but that those decisions are wise as well. Well, there's something, though, about our human nature, isn't there? There's something that, I don't know, it's kind of within us, and it's sort of a little bit of a rebellious streak, maybe, I guess you would say. At least I have that in my life. You know, the word I hate to hear the most is no. I don't know about you all, but no is a hard word for me to swallow. And if you say no to me, chances are I'm going to kind of bristle up and kind of get grumpy and maybe try to convince you that yes is really the right answer. Okay? But I mean, most people do this thing right here as far as that rebellious streak or pushing the boundary or testing the line. Kids are really good at it, but adults, we've got our little talents too, right? Because just think about it. You got to go somewhere, so you get behind the wheel and you're driving down the street and there's a sign on the side of the road and it says 30 miles an hour, right? Now, honestly, you don't really have to raise your hand unless you want to. But how many of you are doing 30 miles an hour or less? Tammy, that is not true. Chances are, right, like the speed limit might be posted at 30, but you know that everybody goes 35, 40, 45? Yeah. Shirley, are you telling on yourself? I mean, you know, like when you commute, I commuted to Atlanta all the time, right? And if you go the speed limit in Atlanta, you're going to get run over. You got to go with the traffic, right? You got to push the boundary. Sure, the speed limit says 70, but you better be going 80 or above, or you're just going to get trampled, right? So isn't that really the right thing to do? Isn't that the wise thing to do? Never mind it's against the law. Never mind you might get pulled over and get a ticket. Especially, I don't know if you all travel a lot anymore, but I know when I'm traveling and I go into a new state, you know how you get like in a little pack of people, right? And you're all going the same speed. Now, it's not the speed limit, but you know, hey, they'll give me 5 or 10 miles an hour, right? So you're just going with the flow, and there's the guy out there, the policeman with the radar gun. Beep, 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 beep. And he sees the whole pack speeding, but you're the one with the out-of-state plate. So who gets caught? You do, right? You get caught. I don't know, though. The whole point is that we all push our boundaries. It may be in our diet, like, the children's sermon. It's hard for me to resist a brownie or a cookie or a piece of cake, something sweet because, man, I really want it. And I can rationalize it and justify it and minimize it. I can say, well, I'll have this cookie and then I won't have any bread with dinner, right? Or potatoes or whatever it is. And it always seems like, it's like eating potato chips too, right? We always just want one more. If you get away with this, then maybe you'll get away with a little bit more. And we just keep pushing that boundary of right and moral and legal even, right? We live on the edge and we think to ourselves, well, if it isn't illegal, then it's permissible. If it isn't wrong, then it's all right. If it's not immoral, then it must be acceptable. If it isn't over the line, then it's fine. So how far over the line can I go, we ask ourselves. How far can we go without getting caught, without getting any kind of consequences from our choices, our decisions, our behavior? How far can we push that line before we find ourselves in a land of regret? Yes, that's the question, right? That's the question at least we ask ourselves as we make decisions in life. We think, well, is there anything really wrong with this? Who am I hurting? Is it illegal? After all, everybody's doing it, right? Well, just because something might be right or popular doesn't mean that we should be doing it, does it? You know, Paul has a great verse when he talks about the difference between what is right and what is wise. And it comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and he says this: I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. You see, I think when it comes down to making decisions, we need not to ask the question, is this the right thing to do? Because something could be right, but it could also be unwise. Right? So the question, the maturity question, really comes down to this: that we should stop and ask ourselves, is this really the wise thing to do? And we should certainly start. Now, this is kind of light on as far as, seeking God's wisdom or God's guidance and so forth. It kind of comes at it from a human perspective, but that doesn't mean that we forget that every major decision we face in life, we need to run it through God. We need to make sure that what we're about to decide is pleasing to God. That's within God's will. We don't want to do something that is counter to what God's plan and purpose is for our life. We don't want to go against His will. But we do participate in that as well. Because I know a lot of people that'll pray, God, I just want your will. And you get the answer and you do the exact opposite, right? No, I didn't mean that, God. What do you mean be a missionary? What do you mean give more money? What do you mean do this? Teach Sunday school class? What do you mean? I didn't mean it that way. I want your other will, the comfortable one. So when we talk about making these decisions, we always talk about it in light of God's will. And that is always the wisest thing to do. Now, Paul does give us some advice here in Ephesians 5. And 15 through 17, they're kind of our key verses for this morning. Paul says and warns us, be very careful then how you live. Hey, he's saying don't be pushing the boundaries. You might not get caught, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't wrong or it wasn't illegal. Even though I may go a little over the speed limit occasionally, I don't always get caught. That doesn't make it right, does it? No. Just because everybody's doing it doesn't make it right. But he goes on, so he says, be careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. In other words, what Paul's really saying here is, redeem your time. Take it back. Make the most of it. Because the days are evil. And we certainly, that's kind of where we get caught up in that, well, it might be right, but it's not very wise kind of thinking, or kind of a paradox there. Because there's a lot of things the world would convince us are right or good. That doesn't mean that they're right and good, does it? That doesn't mean that they align with God's will and His plans and His purpose for you and your life. It just means everybody's doing it, right? Then he goes on to say, therefore do not be foolish. In other words, hey, stupid, wake up. Right? Don't be a fool, but understand what God's will is. And that's always what we want to be seeking, God's will. Now, I just want to go just a really brief rabbit trail here. Because people ask me all the time, I'm trying to figure out what God's will is for my life. I just can't figure it out. Now, there's a certain amount of God's will that we can know. Like we know that it's not God's will that there's violence, injustice, oppression, abuse, all of those things in the world. We know that those are against the will of God. So if you get in an argument with your neighbor over something or other, the length of their grass, right, or the fact that their dog's coming over and using your yard as a bathroom, if you get in that argument, it's not God's will that you go over, knock on the door, and punch your neighbor in the face. Right? We know that for sure. But then there's that other part of God's will for your life, specifically in the decisions you make. It's sort of a mystery. And what do I mean by that? Well, there's a passage in the Bible, you probably remember it. It says, your word is like a lamp unto my feet, right? Now, I want you to imagine for a minute that you're in the woods, and it's really dark. There's no moon out. There's trees all over. You're on a little path, and all you have is a lamp. How far ahead can you see with that lamp? Pretty much just the next step, right? So what do? You have to trust God to direct your steps in order that God's will be done for your life. He doesn't give you the complete roadmap. He doesn't say, well, this is going to happen, and then this, and then that, and then this, and then that. He says, trust me. You want to discover God's will for your life, the key is really trust and obedience. Because He's only going to give you a picture of the next step, the next couple of steps. You're not always going to be able to see that long term, this is where God wants you. Right? So something to remember as you make those decisions. But along the way, God has given us some particular gifts in this life that we can also use. They're sort of reference points, if you will, that help us to make good and wise decisions, that keep us out of trouble, that might keep us from going farther in debt than we already are, or making a bad relationship decision, or making a poor professional or career decision, making just a bad decision, period, that will eventually find we regret. And those reference points are these: past experience, your current circumstances, and your future hopes and dreams, or God's will for your life. So past experience, how does that play into your decision making? Well, your past predisposes you to certain temptations, addictions, attractions, and blind spots, doesn't it? I mean, you're growing up in a household, and the way you grew up, especially when you're younger, you just think everybody grows up the same way you're growing up. Because that's normal to you, so it's normal for everybody else. But we know as we get older, that's not always what's normal. Or there's different ways to live life. And God gives us the gift of memory so that we don't repeat the same mistakes over and over again because we've got that past experience. You know, doing the same thing over and over again expecting a different result, you know what that is. Sanity. But yet we can, if we're not careful, if we're caught up by the emotions or our heart or our feelings, we can easily keep repeating history over and over and over. God's given us that gift of memory, but I don't know about you, but I got a pretty good forgetter. Right? In other words, I can make the same mistake expecting a different result again and again and again, and it takes just pretty much a brick to the side of my head or God going, it's time that you just wise up, dummy, before I really get it. But this week, I had an incident in which I was wise enough where my past experience came in handy. Now, you know that as a church, we typically get lots of phone calls, especially around the holiday season, for people who need help, right? They need help with their utility bill or rent payment or groceries or something along those lines, right? They call the church, and, most of the time, even if I don't feel 100% sure, I always figure, well, I'm going to act on grace, and God can take care of the rest. It's not for me to judge. Maybe they're scamming me. Maybe they're not. Okay? Well, this week, there was a volunteer in the office because Susan Gamble's out on vacation still. Hopefully, she'll be back tomorrow. She didn't move to the beach. So the volunteer answers the phone, and I look up, and I could just tell the expression on her face totally changed. And you could tell that she was really feeling sorry for whoever was, something bad was on the other line, right? And I was there, and so he said, well, hold on a minute, and said, well, this person needs help. Something just, you know how you get those little intuition, those gut feelings? We talked about trusting that gut feeling. Something told me I knew who was on the other end of that line. And so I said, did you get his name? And he said, no, I didn't. Got the name, and I won't give the name out. I'll keep that person anonymous. But needless to say, my blood pressure went from 0 to 100. Because this particular person has a particular knack to call me or the church at just the wrong time. Like 4:30 or 5 o'clock on a Sunday night. And the story is always the same. Hey, this is so-and-so, and I'm diabetic, and we haven't eaten in my wife and I haven't eaten in 3 days, and we have no gas in the car, and we can't get anywhere. Could you order us a pizza? Okay? Now, this isn't a one-time event. This isn't a two-time event, a 10-time event, a 50-time event. This is like the 100th. So I'm like 0 to 60. I say, give me the phone. Hello, so-and-so? Yeah, this is Pastor Tom, and we are not going to be able to help you this time. Blah, 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 blah. I am sorry that you're in a predicament, but you've called us numerous times. Something has to change here. You've got to do something different. Well, then he starts, you want to see a pastor get hot and almost start to cuss? He did it. Well, you all are the church. You're supposed to help people. Boom! It was like a rocket went off in my head. Oh, well, so-and-so, let me just ask you this question. You have a home church that you go to? Well, no, I don't have a home church. And thus you've proved my point that you're simply scamming the system and ruining it for the people who really need help. And he hung up. I laughed for about 2 hours after that conversation. I couldn't believe it. It was so out of character for me to do that because usually, I'm kind of a sucker for a bad, a good story. The story's good enough. Yeah, I'll help you out. But their past experience told me I'm really not helping this person. They need to make a better decision. They need to make a decision to help themselves because by us helping him and his family all the time is just enabling him to continue on a cycle of dependence. It's not freedom, dependence. And our past experience can tell us all kinds of things. You know the places, the people, and the things that you shouldn't do, or the people you shouldn't hang out with, or the places you shouldn't go. Come on. And that's because you've got that past experience. So don't get caught up in that insanity of doing the same thing over and over again. Learn from the past. Remember what happened the last time the situation was similar. Next thing, then, a reference point to think about in making decisions in your life is, what are your current circumstances? Now, when I think about that, for me, I think about folks who lose a loved one, whether it be death or divorce, and I'll specifically speak on divorce. If you've ever experienced divorce, then you know that it's a really tough situation. It's like a death with a ghost that continues to haunt you, right? Because the person's not really gone, they're still there, and it's just bad. It's really bad. And some are better than others, but nonetheless, numerous amounts of people will fall into this pattern, right? They go through a divorce, and it's no longer before the ink dries on the paperwork that they're out there on the prowl looking for their next relationship, right? They're out there because they want companionship, or they're lonely, or they want to share life with somebody, and it's always the same story, that all is so magical when it happens, right? It's just the magic moment. God set this up. It's preordained. The stars are aligned in the right place. And this is the person that you were really supposed to marry, and not that other person that you just got divorced from, right? You goofed up and made a bad decision that you regret, but now God's making it all right, right? Let me tell you, that's a bad decision. It's a bad decision, whether it's a divorce or you break up in a relationship, to jump right into another relationship. Why? Because it takes time to heal from the last relationship. There's still things to sort through. There's still things to deal with. And if you really run into that 1 in a million soulmate, right? Or 1 in a billion, I guess it is now, or 8 billion, or whatever the population is. If you really run into that person and it's really true love, it'll wait. It'll last, and you don't have to rush off and get head over heels in a relationship or in another marriage. So sometimes your current circumstances influence the next wise decision in your life. And when you think about this, I just got to throw this in. Because, like when I went through my divorce, Chris Brown over at Colonial Heights actually set me up with Tammy. Okay? But Chris Brown was on me like from the minute the ink dried on the divorce papers until, I finally said, well, okay, now it's time. But I kept saying, no, it's not time. Nope, not the time. Nope, not the time. Nope, not the time. He wouldn't take no for an answer. So finally, to get him off my back, I dated Tammy. It sounds a lot worse than it really is. The point isn't that, well, I'm getting in trouble now. I'll be sleeping in the yard tonight. Point being, though, you got to heal up, and it's got to be the right timing, right? Because when I finally went out on a date with Tammy, then it was right, and I had a little more clarity at least. Not that everything was great, but as far as me, but it was a lot better. All right, so let me get off of that subject before I really dig myself into a hole. So the third reference point then is, what are your future hopes and dreams? Or as Paul would say, what's God's will for your life? When you're making a big decision, you know that there are certain things that you can't do because they're going to contradict the direction in which you want to go in life, your long-term goals and dreams, or God's will for your life, right? So you need to do things that stay in alignment with God's will for your life, His plan and purpose for your life, and get you to where you want to go. Simple as that. And that means that sometimes you're going to have to sacrifice one thing for something else, right? You're going to have to make decisions that eliminate certain choices as you make that decision. You know, I can think of, before housing became what it is today, you had to have the 10% down and all this, and so people would have to save up and save up and save up. And I can remember thinking, I'm never going to get a house because I can't save the 10% that it takes to get a down payment for the house. Well, why couldn't I afford the 10%? Because I was making other choices. The vacation was more important. The car was more important. This was more important. You have to set your priorities in a way that gets you to where you want to be. And when it comes to God's will in your life, we have to be cognizant of the decisions we make and the choices we make. And we can ask ourselves just the simple question: is this going to get me to where I think God is calling me to be? Is this going to be pleasing to God? It's not pleasing to God if it goes against the Scriptures. If it goes against Christian teachings, it's not pleasing to God. You can eliminate it. It's not going to get you where you want to go. So those are your 3 reference points. And so to just sum it up, don't push your luck and try to press, closer and closer to the line, living on the edge all the time. And just because it's right doesn't mean it's wise. And ask yourself those questions this week. Is it wise? Given my past experience, is it wise? Given my current circumstance, is it wise? Given where I think God's calling me to go and my future hopes and dreams, is it the wise thing